What if I told you the world's first banks weren't built by kings, they weren't created by merchants, and they weren't designed for profit at all? They were built for the gods. Long before Wall Street, before central banks, before paper money or credit scores, temples quietly became the most powerful financial institutions on earth. They held gold when kings went broke. They lent money when merchants failed. They stabilized currencies when empires collapsed. And almost no one today talks about it. We're taught that religion and economics lived in separate worlds, that faith belonged to belief and money belonged to markets. But history tells a very different story, one that forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. Did ancient religions survive because of faith, or because they mastered finance? Tonight, we're uncovering a hidden economy, one buried beneath ritual, myth, and stone. A system that shaped trade routes, funded empires, and quietly trained the financial systems we still live under today. But this story isn't just about the past, because every system that concentrates trust, wealth, and power eventually reaches a breaking point, and temples were no exception. To understand why temples became financial giants, we need to go back to a time before banks, contracts, or even writing in many regions. In the ancient world, trust was the rarest currency of all. There was no national identity, no police force as we understand it, no centralized authority that guaranteed transactions across regions. If you lived in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China, or Mesoamerica, trade was dangerous. Goods traveled slowly, theft was common, contracts were fragile. So where could people safely store wealth? The answer was simple and universal: the house of the gods. Temples were seen as inviolable. To steal from a temple wasn't just theft, it was cosmic rebellion. Divine punishment was believed to follow not just the criminal, but their family, their crops, even their city. This belief created something revolutionary. The first large-scale trust institutions in human history. People trusted temples more than kings, more than warriors, or the merchants. And temples used that trust to build something far more powerful than prayer. They built systems. Let's begin in ancient Mesopotamia, around 3000 BCE. The earliest known temples, like those dedicated to Inanna or Enlil, weren't just religious centers. They were administrative hubs. They stored grain, they tracked labor, they recorded debts on clay tablets, they redistributed food during droughts. In fact, many historians now believe writing itself evolved to track temple inventories and loans. Temples controlled surplus, and surplus is power. Farmers brought excess grain as offerings. Artisans paid a portion of their production. Traders deposited silver for safekeeping. The temple didn't just store these goods, it reallocated them strategically. Loans were issued to farmers before planting season. Food was distributed during famine. Workers were paid from temple stores. Interest existed, debt existed, default existed. But it all operated under a sacred framework. If you failed to repay the temple, you didn't just owe money, you owed the gods. That psychological pressure dramatically reduced risk, which made temples far more reliable lenders than private individuals. And slowly, quietly, temples became the backbone of regional economies. As civilizations grew, so did temple wealth. In ancient Egypt, temples owned vast tracts of land. Some controlled up to 1/3 of all arable land during certain dynasties. They employed thousands of workers. They managed grain reserves larger than royal treasuries. They operated workshops, mines, and trade caravans. The temple of Amun at Karnak was so wealthy that pharaohs sometimes borrowed from it to fund wars. In India, Hindu temples functioned as credit institutions, issuing loans to villagers and kings alike. Temple endowments financed irrigation projects, roads, and festivals that stimulated local economies. In Greece, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi acted as an international financial hub. City-states deposited gold there. Loans were negotiated on sacred ground. Political decisions were often tied to financial dependencies disguised as divine prophecy. And in Rome, temples safeguarded private wealth during times of instability. Senators stored fortunes in sacred vaults because even invading armies hesitated to loot them. The pattern was clear across civilizations. 1. Faith created trust. 2. Trust attracted deposits. 3. Deposits enabled lending. 4. Lending generated influence. By the time formal banks appeared, temples had already perfected the model. Here's the twist most people miss. Temples didn't need to own everything. They only needed to mediate access. By controlling credit, storage, and ritual legitimacy, temples could shape entire economies without overt political rule. If a ruler angered the priesthood, offerings slowed. If a city lost divine favor, trade dried up. If a debt was forgiven during a jubilee, loyalty surged. Temples also mastered debt cycles. In Mesopotamia, periodic debt cancellations, often proclaimed as divine acts, prevented total social collapse while reinforcing religious authority. People didn't thank economic reform, they thanked the gods. And the priests became indispensable intermediaries between survival and scarcity. This wasn't accidental. It was systemic. But no system that centralizes wealth and trust escapes tension forever. As temple wealth grew, so did resentment. Kings began to fear religious institutions more than foreign enemies. Merchants resented interest obligations disguised as offerings. Peasants questioned why the gods' houses glittered while their fields starved. The same trust that made temples powerful also made them dangerous. And eventually, rulers would face a choice. Submit to sacred finance, or seize it. That choice would reshape history. In the next part, we'll explore what happened when temple economies reached their breaking point, when kings cracked open sacred vaults, when faith collided with state power, and when religious financial systems began to fracture under their own success. Because what replaced them didn't eliminate the model, we merely secularized it. And the consequences are still unfolding today. Every system built on trust eventually faces a moment of crisis, not because it fails, but because it becomes too powerful. By the late stages of many ancient civilizations, temple economies had accumulated something unprecedented: massive wealth, control over credit, influence over food supply, moral authority over the population, and most dangerously of all, independence from the state. Kings could raise armies, they could levy taxes, they could issue laws, but temples controlled legitimacy. And when financial crises hit, famines, wars, inflation, rulers began to realize a terrifying truth: the real treasury wasn't the palace, it was the temple. History records the same pattern again and again. In Mesopotamia, kings raided temple storehouses during wartime. In Egypt, pharaohs nationalized temple lands when state revenues collapsed. In Rome, emperors confiscated sacred wealth to pay legions and stabilize debased currencies. Each time, the justification was the same: this is an emergency. The gods would want survival. This is temporary. It never was. Once sacred wealth became a political solution, the invisible wall protecting temple finance cracked. And with it, public trust began to fracture. Temple economies didn't collapse because religion weakened. They collapsed because scale changed everything. As trade expanded and populations grew, temples faced new pressures. Long-distance commerce demanded liquidity. Empires required standing armies. Currency debasement disrupted fixed offerings. Political ambition clashed with priestly autonomy. Temples had been designed for local trust economies, not imperial systems. When silver shortages hit, temples couldn't absorb losses forever. When wars dragged on, debt jubilees became politically dangerous. When rulers centralized power, sacred exemptions looked like threats. And slowly, a transformation occurred. Economic power moved from divine authority to legal authority. The gods didn't disappear, but their balance sheets did. What replaced temple economies wasn't a clean break, it was an imitation. States adopted the functions of temples while stripping away the theology. State treasuries replaced sacred vaults. Legal enforcement replaced divine punishment. Taxation replaced offerings. Bureaucrats replaced priests, but the logic stayed the same. Centralize trust, control surplus, manage debt, maintain legitimacy. Roman law formalized contracts once guaranteed by ritual. Medieval monarchies issued charters once sanctified by gods. Renaissance banks adopted temple practices: alts, ledgers, interest, deposit safety without the altars. Even the language survived. Credit comes from credere, to believe. Trust remained foundational. Confidence became the invisible pillar of money. The sacred had gone secular, but the structure endured. Here's the uncomfortable part. Every attempt to replace temple finance recreated its flaws. Kings promised stability, then debased currency. Banks promised neutrality, then served elites. States promised protection, then socialized losses. Without sacred limits, expansion accelerated, debt grew faster, speculation replaced ritual restraint, trust shifted from fear of gods to faith in systems, and just like temples before them, modern institutions reached a familiar crossroads, too big to question, too trusted to audit, too powerful to fail. Sound familiar? Look closely at the modern world. Central banks now hold gold reserves once guarded by priests. Financial districts sit where temples once stood, geographic centers of trust. Economic confidence determines survival more than material wealth. During crises, governments inject liquidity the way temples once released grain, and when systems fail, debt forgiveness returns rebranded as bailouts, stimulus, restructuring. Even the moral framing remains. Crises unexplained as design flaws. Modern people blame market forces. Different language. 1. Societies build trust institutions. 2. Trust attracts wealth. 3. Wealth attracts power. 4. Power attracts exploitation. 5. Exploitation erodes trust. Temples weren't corrupted because religion failed. They failed because any system combining morality, money, and authority invites abuse at scale, and yet, human societies cannot function without centralized trust. 3 clear takeaways. Takeaway number 2. Institutions don't fail randomly, they fail predictably. Takeaway number 3. Modern finance is not new, it's ancient power without sacred limits. We didn't escape temple economics. No system corrects itself without consequences. It's whether we'll recognize it when it arrives. If this changed how you see money, history, or power, leave a comment with one question that's raised for you. And the most powerful truths are the ones hidden in plain sight.